Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. Michael Odijie, and we're going to be talking about abolitionism on the Gold Coast. Hello, Michael. How are you doing?
I'm very fine, Mr. Martins. Hello.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
yes, I'm great, Michael. So, guys, you might not have known this, but some time ago I interviewed Michael, but unfortunately I wasn't able to share that excellent video with you guys because Zoom was being so inefficient. So I didn't even record the video, but today we're going to be discussing an innovative paper. You're talking about abolitionism on the Gold Coast. And this paper is fascinating because your paper is exploring native abolitionism. But before we talk about native abolitionism, Michael, there was indigenous slavery in Africa. What was the nature of slavery on the Gold Coast? What did slaves do?
Okay, thank you very much. So the best way to answer that would be to make a distinction between transatlantic slavery and domestic slavery, which is what you call indigenous slavery. So after the abolition of transatlantic slavery, domestic slavery continued. um, just before. So slave merchants can raid, buy, sell, use slaves. So the abolition of transatlantic slavery by the British in 1807 did not actually change the nature of domestic slavery in the Gold Coast.
You mean the abolition of
When,
the transatlantic slave trade in 1807?
yes,
Yeah.
did not, well, it did a little, but the point I'm making is that domestic slave trade and slave holding continued in the countries. So the abolition that we are talking about today is the abolition of domestic slavery, how Africans came up and became opposed to domestic slavery, which is different from transatlantic slavery. So domestic slaves were treated differently from the way slaves that were sent to, say, America or West Indies, because it wasn't based on pure economic exploitation. Some of the domestic slaves were just servants. However, others were treated even worse because some societies then practiced human sacrifice, and domestic slaves are often the victims of human sacrifice. So, as a matter of fact, the first campaign against domestic slavery was against human sacrifice. So, after abolition of human sacrifice, you then have a new campaign against domestic slavery. Yeah.
And I know that in East Africa, some slaves, they planted cloves in the Asante Empire. That Asante was imperial power on the Gold Coast. They planted other cash crops. Did they also plant cola? I know that cola is big on the Gold Coast.
Yes, as a matter of fact, there was some form of, if you like, capitalist mode of production in some West African regions, certainly in Ashanti. So Ashantis had plantations. So they planted different crops. Domestic slaves often were used in some of the plantations, but they were not treated the way slaves were treated in, say, America or in the Caribbean with chains and padlocks. None of that. They were treated more humanely. But a vast majority of domestic slaves were not workers, if you like, working in plantations. Some of them were just, as a matter of fact, in some West African cultures, domestic slaves are considered almost part of the family. So in Fanti, for example, the Fantis they are Akan just like Ashantis. So Fantis treat their domestic slaves more humanely than, say, the Ashantis. So domestic slaves in some cases can inherit the properties of their masters. So if there's the master have no offspring, it is almost custom for the domestic slave to inherit the master's property. So some Africans don't even think the term domestic slaves, the term slaves, it's accurate for describing domestic slaves. So the example of this would be, say, John Sabah, a very great Good Coast intellectual in the 19th century.
What is his
So
name? John who?
John Sabah,
Okay.
Sarbah, yeah. He argued in his book that the term slave does not accurately translate to the nature of, say, if you like, slavery in Fanti. So Fantis have a certain term for slaves. So the British, or if you like, Europeans, translated this to mean slaves, slave, SLAVE. So some African intellectuals would argue that slave is not the appropriate term, that it doesn't translate properly because the term slavery conjure up images of squalor, of maltreatment, of whip. You don't have this in some African cultures.
Michael,
Yes.
was slavery heritable? So if your mother was a slave, would you also become a slave?
In most cultures, yes. So in the Igbo, for example, the Igbos are the eastern part of Nigeria. In the 19th century, the Igbos were divided into three, if you like, three class or three castes. One, the Amadi, they are the freeborn. Then there's the Ohu. The Ohu are the slaves. That's the, if you like, and then there's the Osu. The Osu are the sort of religious slaves. So they are slaves, but they are non-slaves like the Ohu. So if your parents are Ohu, automatically you become an Ohu. So if your parents are also Osu, you become an Osu. So it's inherited, but not in every case. So there's a great deal of diversity. There's a great deal of difference in Africa. So in some cases, in other cases, it's not the case. And the meaning of slavery in most cultures, there are different types of slaves. So Igbo, we just talked about the Osu and the Ohu. So the Osus they're outcasts. Because they are religious slaves. They are almost sort of cursed. Whereas the Ohu are not like that. The Ohu are much more, yeah, they are closer to the European definition of slaves. So you can buy and sell Ohu, but not so much Osu. So the Fantis have, I think, about 10 different forms of slavery. They have 10 different categories, more than 10 even. So they are slaves who are, I think, in the modern parlance would be close to, I would even say maid. They are slaves who would be close to even, say, personal assistant, but they are slaves. Where the other extreme would be slaves that are earmarked for human sacrifice, slaves from the hinterland, and so on and so forth. So it is usually helpful to, when discussing slavery in Africa, especially domestic slavery, non-transatlantic slavery, to explain the context. So you're discussing it in reference to this particular place, this particular time, because the nature of slavery, of domestic slavery, changed over time.
And Michael, even today in Nigeria, descendants of Osu slaves still experience discrimination.
Yes. So one form of discrimination that the Osus experience is marriage. The reason is because they are religious slaves, or if you like, court slaves. There is a traditional edict against them that if you marry an Osu, you become an Osu. So all your siblings, they are now Osus. So for this reason, if a young Igbo man is looking to get married, it is the custom for the family of the man to investigate, or even the other way around, an Igbo woman to investigate the genealogy of the to whoever they are getting married to. So if they are an Osu, obviously that's a no-no, because it means your family, they are sort of outcast. Your your the minute you get married to them, you become an Osu, and your siblings, so your offsprings as well. So that's a different form of so if you like, that's classificatory slavery. So it's not slavery the way we understand slavery. So there's no exploitation of labor. Whereas other forms of slavery in the Igbo region, say Ohu no longer exist the way say Osu does, because Ohu was exploitation of labor. You buy a slave and then you use this slave, you know, you exploit the labor, use them in farm, trading, as the case may be. So after abolition of slavery, that Ohu, that form of slavery basically disappeared. Whereas Osu, because there's a sort of religious, or if you like, spiritual significance to it, continued. So there's a great deal of campaign against Osu currently, but it's still there.
Michael, in the Asante Empire, other than inheriting the status of slavery, how did one become a slave? Were these people captured during warfare? Were they bought? How did the Asante Empire acquire slaves?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. So there are different ways of acquiring slaves. So raiding is one. So if the as we were describing about, if you're born to if you're born to slave parents, by almost by definition, you are a slave. In some cases, you belong to your parents' master. But the way the Ashantis acquired slaves, well, I would say the one of the interesting way that they acquired slaves is through tribute, payment of tribute. So Ashanti Empire had um, um, so many chiefs in the northern region of modern Ghana that were under the empire. So these chiefs are required to pay taxes to the Ashanti Hene, that's the king of Ashanti, every year or every month, as the case may be. In some cases, some of these chiefs would have to pay in slaves. So they have to pay, say, give 1,000 slaves to Ashanti, or 500 slaves, or 200 slaves, as the case may be. So these chiefs either have to give their own people, or in some cases, they have to raid less powerful um, groups. So they just conduct raid and then give the number, if you like, this is tax, pay the tax to the Ashanti Hene. That's one way that the Ashantis acquired slaves. Another way that they acquired slaves was through raiding. So they did direct raiding but in most cases, it's not the king himself doing the raiding. Um, they did direct raiding of less powerful groups, less powerful ethnic groups. So there's so many in history. There's one creepy, Crepee. I think it used to be a town in the maybe the western part of modern Ghana. Ashantis would go there and then raid, then sell the slaves. So that's another way. But I think the tribute system is the main is because the number of slaves that came through the tribute system is unbelievable. Thousands of slaves every year marched to Ashanti and then given to the king as a form of tax. So what the Ashantis did during slave trade is, because the Ashanti kingdom it's not in the coastal region. They have to sell the slaves through Fantis. So Fantis were the middlemen between Ashantis and Europeans. So the Fantis are in the coast, like Cape Coast, Anumabo. These are Fanti region. So yeah, but in other cases, say in the Igbo, that's the Biafra. It was mainly raiding. So one of the reasons for that is because the Igbos are not as centralized as say Ashantis were. So there's no one Igbo king or one Igbo chief controlling controlling anything. So there was a great deal of raiding in the Igbo region. But the Igbos also have not just the Igbos, the Aro, ARO. They had a Juju. I think there's a it's called long Juju.
Yes.
So yeah,
Michael,
I don't
I'm
know.
familiar with the term because I love Nollywood movies. So the
Yeah.
Nollywood movies some of them at least are quite historically accurate, and they are
Yes.
adept at promoting the Igbo culture. So we learn about chi. So chi is a
Yeah.
concept in Igbo religion. So yes, I'm familiar
Yes.
with the concept of the
Yeah.
Juju and the Dibia and all those
Yeah.
other
So
names.
I'll just be brief. The long Juju settles cases, and so if there's a fight over land or fight over anything, you can take the case to the long Juju. Usually, the loser of any case would be the myth is that the long Juju devours the loser, that kills the loser. But the arrows, who were the custodian of long Juju, they were playing a trick. So the losers usually they would sell the loser to. So that's one easy way of them getting slaves without having to raid. The long juju is just there. There are thousands of people coming in to for cases. The loser of any case, the others would take the loser and then sell to. So one of the ways that when the British wanted to abolish domestic slavery in the Igbo region, they judged correctly that they have to destroy the long juju because without destroying the long juju, there's no way to abolish domestic slavery. This is why one of the reasons, if not the main reason, for the Aro expedition, I think it was 1900 or 1901. It was a sort of war between the British and the Aros. The Aros are one group within the Igbo um, within the Igbo tribe. So the British then had to destroy the Long Juju as way of abolishing
Michael, is it long Juju or land Juju?
Long, Long
Yeah,
Juju.
long
So
Juju.
long, yeah. So Long Juju is the way that the Igbo. So it's the way that the British pronounced the. So it's Long Juju of Awochuku. So that's the way that the British pronounced the Juju, just because they can't pronounce the local name of the long Juju. So the local name is Ibini Ukbabi, Ibini Ukpabi. Ibini Ukbabi. So because they can't pronounce it, they just called it long Juju. Um, yeah.
Now we're going to talk about abolition in
Okay.
the Gold Coast. I read the article by Parry. So Parry is somewhat of a pioneer in the field. I read his article some time ago, and I also read your article. We're going
Yeah.
to talk about James Brew. Was James Brew mixed?
Yeah, he was missed, but he was missed down the road. I think his great grandfather, Richard Brew, was an Irishman. But if you see him, if you see a photograph of him, you probably won't know that he's missed because um, so but he was missed. Yes, yeah.
And and who was James Brew?
Okay, so there are two ways of answering that. So James Brew he was a pioneer in I would say two sectors in Gold Coast. The first is, I would say, I don't know if you've heard of Fanti
Yes,
Confederacy
I
or
have. I
Fanti
have.
Confederation. Yeah. So James Brew was one of the intellectuals behind Fancy Confederation. He was the one that wrote the Constitution of Fancy Confederation. The Constitution is still online now; anybody can read it. So the Fancy Confederation is the first attempt, I would say, maybe in Africa, but certainly in West Africa, by a group of Africans to lobby for self-government, or if you like, to try um, we all know that in the post-World War years, you have people like Kwame Nkrumah arguing that Africans should be independent. But this was 100 years before then. I'm talking about 1968, sorry, 1868, 1869, 1870, 71, 72. So Fantis are a group in Ghana, a sort of tribal group. They have little, they are separated by, so there are different villages. Cape Coast and Numabo, these are like Fanti villages. So they came together and formed a confederacy. So they wanted to form a self, they basically wanted to form a modern state. So James Brew was one of the pioneers behind this. He was a lawyer, and so he wrote the Constitution. When he submitted the Constitution to the then British administrator in Cape Coast Castle, he was arrested for sedition, because then the idea of Africans trying to create self-government was almost unknown to, I would say, to Europeans then. So I would say he was probably the most important person under in the Fanti Confederation. He wrote the Constitution, he wrote basically all the documents relating to Fanti Confederation. So he was the one that submitted it to the British, then the British turned it down. So he was also a pioneer of Gold Coast Press. That's local newspapers. So he founded two local newspapers, Good Coast Times, which was the first local print newspaper. He founded that in 1874, and Western Echo. So he also founded Western Echo, I think in 1885 or 1886. So he was also a lawyer. So and an abolitionist. That's somebody who was, if you like, opposed to domestic slavery. It is, I have to point out that his grandfather was one of the biggest slave traders in his time.
Michael, James
Yeah.
also proposed the Deputation Scheme.
Yes,
You
he
can tell us
did.
about that,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, yeah. So I was coming to that. So the whole point of creating Western Echo, this newspaper, was to basically campaign for the deputation scheme. So he's in my view, he would be probably the most important person in, say, the trajectory of Ghana's history in especially in 20th century. So the way if you read the pre-colonial years of Kwame Nkrumah, the Big Sis, some of the ideas that they espoused, James Brew touched on these 80, 90 years before them, 70, 80 years before them. So we just have to first of all state that his grandfather was a huge slave trader. His great 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 grandfather, Richard Brew, was probably the biggest slave trader in the whole of Gold Coast, of modern Gold Coast. So he came from this sort of slave trading family, but by the time you get to his father, so his grandfather was the last. So his grandfather existed precisely when the British abolished transatlantic slave trade. So he continued to, so he was an illicit slave trader. He continued to even export slaves. So he then had a connection with Ashanti Hene, the then king of Ashanti. So he would bring slaves down from Ashanti and export them. But after he died, James Brew's father, that's where it stopped in his lineage. So his father was known to slave trader. His father was a British colonial administrator. By the time we get to his point, he was a lawyer, a very talented and extremely brilliant lawyer. So in 1874, which was the year that Gold Coast became a British colony officially. So before 1874, it was a protectorate. So in 1874, when it became a colony, the new governor, or the first governor, I think his name is George Strahan, decided to abolish domestic slavery. The reason for this is because the British have this practice where they don't allow domestic slavery in British colonies. So now Gold Coast is becoming a colony in 1874. So the whole point is that they now have to abolish domestic slavery. However, the British wanted to abolish domestic slavery without really abolishing it. So the way that they went about this, it's something called the Indian model of abolishing domestic slavery. There's the Indian model. It's I think it's called the Indian model because the British tried it in India a couple of years ago, a couple of years before 1875, 1874. Is to create a law, like an ordinance, saying um, henceforth slavery is now outlawed, but doing nothing about it. So you don't just abolish, you have to administer the abolition. So the British just wanted to say, okay, slavery now is it's abolished without doing anything. That is, without the follow-up. Whereas somebody like James Brew and people and other African abolitionists wanted to put an end to domestic slavery totally. So they came up with this idea of to put a complete end to slave to domestic slavery. One, you don't just have to create a law and then be back out. You have to think of what to do about because all of a sudden you have thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people are now free from their masters. So what do you do about them? So James Brew argued that the British should distribute land to them so that these former slaves can, land is the basis of wealth. Then they can, become farmers or build little huts for themselves, as the case may be. And the British also argued, James Brew, sorry, also argued that the British should pay out compensation to slave owners. So the reason for this is because slavery, holding or owning slaves, is a form of property. And the British, before then, have a tradition of paying slave owners whenever they proceed with, abolition of slave of slavery. So the classic example of this would be West Indies in 1833-34, when the British abolished slavery in West Indies. They paid out millions to slave owners because they understood that slavery is a form of property. I mean, to the modern ear,
Michael,
yeah,
Michael, I have to stop
yeah.
you. The deputation scheme. Did you talk about that? I don't remember us talking about it because
Yeah, we'll come to that.
okay.
We'll come to that. So the deputation scheme is from mid 1870s now. So, so there was a conflict between I'll quickly come to that now. African abolitionists, for which James Brew was the head, and the British, because they felt that the British were not really serious about abolition. So James Brew then teamed up with women's group, and local chiefs to write petition, basically to petition the governor that they wanted compensation. But this led to a real struggle between the colonial government and people like James Brew. But the colonial government succeeded in basically instituting the abolition without either paying compensation or without creating the basis for survival of former slaves. That was 1874, 1875. The deputation scheme um, was an attempt by James Brew to create a new basis for Africans in Gold Coast to represent their grievances in London. So James Brew felt everything that he did in his life, the Fancy Confederation one, and even starting a newspaper, was an attempt for him to argue that Africans should be added or should contribute to the administration of Gold Coast. He felt seriously that that's the British colonial government, there's this disconnection between their understanding of, say, the African way and he felt bringing Africans into the administration, it's one way of bridging this gap between the British understanding of Africa and the laws that they are creating to sort of govern Africa. So the deputation scheme was an attempt by him, so it's almost like Fancy Confederation again, but in a different way, to create a deputation that would be sent to London, to the colonial office, and possibly to the parliament as well. The idea is that this deputation would represent Africans, I'm saying African, but now Gold Coast grievances. The grievances are a lot, but number one is the abolition is the number one grievance. This is 10 years after the abolition of slavery. It went very badly. Trade between the colony and that's between the Fantis and Ashantis depressed. The reason for this is because slaves were, if you're coming to say Fanti, if you're trading between Fanti and Ashanti, you need slaves to help you to move the product from one place to the other. Ashanti traders became scared of coming to Fanti because remember then by that particular, I'm talking of 18 the late 1900s, Ashanti was not part of the colony. Ashanti joined the colony I think in early 20th century. So because of the abolition of slavery in the Fanti region, that's the Gold Coast, not modern Ghana, I would say half of modern Ghana, the trade between the colony and Ashanti is depressed. So, which is why people like James Brew and educated Fantis or educated men in the colony, who almost all of them are traders, they became really angry that this is what abolition basically created this huge poverty, oppression of trade. They are now freed slaves that have nothing to do, they have no access to land, and they are doing all sorts of things like criminal activities and so
Michael,
on.
are you a Nigerian?
Yes, I am.
And where are you from in Nigeria? Which tribe?
I'm from the south. I'm from Edo State,
Or
so I'm from a.
are you Igbo?
No, I'm not Igbo, but I'm a little close to Igbo.
Okay. Well, I'm from Jamaica. Many of our slaves came from the Gold Coast and the Bight of Biafra.
Yes, from the bite. Yeah, I think mostly from the bite of Biafra. Yeah.
Yeah, so I
So
could be a descendant of an Igbo man or woman.
that is correct. That
Yeah,
is possible.
I think I am. I'm really interested in Igbo culture.
Yeah,
Igbos are quite entrepreneurial and intellectual. So I
yeah.
interviewed the Jamaican academic who teaches at Harvard, Orlando Patterson, and he said that he assumed that he was not Igbo, but apparently he did some tests and he's of Igbo origin.
Yeah.
And
You can test if you want. It's possible to check. Um, it's possible for you
yes, it
to
is. It
check
is.
if you want. Yeah.
So,
So
Michael,
so like I was saying, the
what are you?
deputation scheme
Okay, you can
came
continue.
out of the deputation scheme came out of the frustration and the problems that the British model of abolition created, or the British model of emancipation. So Brew was the one behind the deputation scheme.
So we're wrapping up.
Um,
But before we wrap up, Michael, what are you
yeah.
working on now? What is your new area of research?
I'm actually currently working on this abolition question. So apart from James Brew, there was another Francis Ferron. To Francis Ferron is even more radical than James Brew. So he got into a fight with the British governor in the late 19th century, which is what I'm currently publishing a paper on him. See, because even after abolition, the British governor was, if you like, promoting domestic slavery indirectly for administrative convenience. So there became a tension between him and African abolitionists, some sort of African, I don't want to say ideologues, but these sort of new educated Africans that some of them are Christians, some are not, that are very critical of the the not just the sort of colonial policies, but of certain African practices like slavery and domestic slavery. So then you have this Francis Ferron, um, who hated domestic slavery, challenging the governor, then British governor. And I'm talking about 1889, 1890, 1891, 92, 93 to 97, who was indirectly promoting domestic slavery for his administrative convenience.
All
So
right, great.
yeah.
So I look forward to reading it, and speaking to you has been a pleasure. You were great, just like in our prior interview that I did not get to share. But I think we will speak again, Michael. Bye.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Yes.
Bye.